A quiet escape turns chaotic. Agent Jordan Blake usually found her solace in the bustling yet peaceful pockets of Riverside Park in Brookfield. The city was known for its towering skyscrapers and vibrant streets, but Riverside Park offered a rare slice of serenity amid the urban chaos. For Jordan, an FBI agent who had spent most of her adult life navigating high-stakes operations and hostile environments, the park was her refuge, a place where she could leave her professional identity behind, even if only for a moment. It was a warm Saturday morning, and Jordan felt the weight of her work week settle on her shoulders as she pulled her car into a shaded spot beneath an ancient oak tree. The sight of the sprawling green landscape, punctuated by the cheerful sounds of families enjoying their weekend, provided a soothing backdrop that eased some of her tension. She inhaled deeply, letting the scent of freshly cut grass and blooming flowers wash over her. For a brief moment, she wasn't Agent Blake, the unflinching, resilient FBI operative. She was simply Jordan, a woman in search of a peaceful escape. Dressed casually in jeans, a simple sweatshirt, and her favorite worn leather jacket, Jordan looked every bit the part of a city dweller seeking some quiet time. She carried a book she had been meaning to start for weeks and a tote bag filled with snacks, hoping to lose herself in the world of fiction as she sat by her favorite bench overlooking the lake. The bench was nestled in a secluded spot beneath a canopy of trees, with a clear view of the lake where ducks glided peacefully across the water. Jordan settled in, exhaling as she let the tranquility envelop her. As she opened her book, she felt her muscles relax, and the tension in her mind began to dissipate. The world around her faded as she dove into the story, eager to escape reality for a little while. However, her peace was abruptly shattered when a harsh, authoritative voice cut through the serene atmosphere. "Hey, you! Move!" Jordan looked up, startled to see a man standing in front of her, his face twisted in irritation. He was tall and rugged, dressed in plain clothes that did little to hide his imposing presence. His eyes narrowed at her, a glint of disdain flickering in his gaze, as if she had committed a grievous offense simply by existing. "Excuse me," she asked, her voice calm but firm. Despite her surprise, she maintained her composure, a skill honed from years of intense field training. She was no stranger to confrontation, but she had not expected it here, in her safe haven. "You heard me," he snapped, gesturing toward the bench with a dismissive flick of his hand. "This is my spot. I sit here every Saturday. So, why don't you move along?" Jordan blinked, taken aback by the sheer audacity of his demand. She looked around, noting the empty benches scattered throughout the park. It was a public space after all, and there were plenty of other places he could sit. She took a steadying breath, determined to keep the situation from escalating. "This is a public park," she replied, keeping her tone neutral but assertive. "There are plenty of other benches. I'm sure you can find one that suits you just as well." The man's expression hardened, his lips curling into a sneer. "People like you just don't get it, do you?" he muttered, his words dripping with barely concealed contempt. "You don't belong here, taking over spaces that aren't yours." A spark of anger ignited within Jordan. "People like you." She had heard those words before, too many times in too many places. They were the words of someone who saw her as other, as someone who didn't belong simply because of the color of her skin. She had spent years working to dismantle stereotypes, to prove her worth and capabilities in a field that wasn't always welcoming. Yet here she was, in her own city, being told she didn't belong on a public bench. "Listen," she said, her voice steady but edged with a hint of steel. "I'm not moving. I have just as much right to sit here as you do. So, if you're looking for a confrontation, you're not going to get it from me. Find another bench." Her words seemed to enrage him further. He took a step closer, his body language menacing as he invaded her personal space. "You think you're tough, huh? Acting like you own the place," he sneered, his tone thick with arrogance. "You don't belong here. You should know your place." Jordan's patience began to wear thin. She had come here to find peace, not to deal with a bully. But even as her frustration mounted, she reminded herself to stay calm. She had been trained to de-escalate tense situations, to maintain control even when provoked. Yet the man's words struck a nerve, each one laden with the ugly weight of prejudice. "I don't need your permission to be here," she replied coolly. "And I won't be intimidated by someone who thinks he can bully others into submission." The man's face flushed with anger, and his hands clenched into fists. He looked as though he were on the verge of physically removing her from the bench. But before he could act, a few passers-by began to stop and observe, their curious gazes fixed on the unfolding confrontation. The man noticed the onlookers, his posture shifting slightly as he became aware of his audience. He straightened, attempting to mask his aggression with a condescending smirk. "Fine," he spat. "Enjoy your little attitude. Just remember, people like you don't belong here. You'll learn that soon enough." With a final glare, he turned and stalked off, leaving Jordan simmering with a mix of anger and disbelief. She took a deep breath, trying to shake off the encounter. But the man's words lingered, casting a shadow over her afternoon. She had encountered prejudice before, but it never became easier to swallow. It was a bitter reminder of the ignorance that still permeated society, even in places as seemingly progressive as Brookfield. Just as she began to settle back into her book, she sensed movement out of the corner of her eye. Looking up, she saw the man again, approaching with a look of renewed hostility. This time, there was no pretense of civility in his expression, only a raw, unfiltered contempt that sent a chill down her spine. "I thought I made myself clear," he said, his voice low and threatening. "This is my spot." Jordan set her book down and rose to her feet, meeting his gaze with a steely resolve. She wasn't about to back down from someone who thought he could intimidate her into submission. "I told you, I'm not moving," she replied, her voice calm but firm. "This is a public space, and you have no right to tell me where I can or can't sit." The man's smirk deepened, his eyes glinting with malice. "You people always think you're entitled to everything, don't you?" he sneered. "Always thinking you can just take over wherever you go." Jordan's fists clenched at her sides, fury boiling within her. She had worked too hard, sacrificed too much, to be reduced to a stereotype by a stranger who didn't even know her. But as tempting as it was to respond with anger, she held her ground, refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing her rattled. "You don't get to talk to me like that," she said, her voice laced with quiet strength. "If you have a problem, maybe you should take a hard look at yourself instead of trying to project it onto others." The man's expression twisted with rage, and before she could react, he reached out and grabbed her arm, his grip painfully tight. "You think you can talk to me that way?" he hissed, his voice a low, menacing growl. "Maybe it's time someone taught you a lesson." Jordan's heart raced, but her training kicked in, and she maintained her composure. She met his gaze, her expression unflinching as she spoke in a tone of icy calm. "That was a mistake," she said, her voice steady. With one swift motion, she reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out her FBI badge, holding it up so that it caught the sunlight. The man's bravado evaporated in an instant, his face draining of color as he stared at the badge, his eyes widening in disbelief. You're FBI," he stammered, his confidence crumbling. "That's right," Jordan replied, her tone cold and unyielding. "And you're under arrest for assaulting a federal agent." The man took a step back, panic flashing across his face as he realized the gravity of his actions. His gaze darted around, searching for an escape, but he was trapped. Without another word, he turned and bolted toward the parking lot, his desperation fueling his flight. Jordan didn't hesitate. She took off after him, adrenaline surging as she pursued him across the park. The crowd watched in stunned silence, their gazes following the chase as it unfolded. Jordan's focus sharpened, her mind racing as she calculated her next move. She couldn't let him get away, not after what he'd done. As she closed in on him, the man glanced back, his face contorted with fear. He fumbled for his car keys, his hand shaking as he attempted to unlock the door. But Jordan was faster, her training and determination propelling her forward. "Stop," she commanded, her voice echoing across the parking lot. "You're not going anywhere." The man's panic reached a fever pitch as he realized he had nowhere left to run. And in that moment, Jordan knew that this was more than just a confrontation. It was a test of resilience, justice, and the strength to stand up against ignorance, no matter the cost. The confrontation escalates. As Jordan sprinted after the man through the parking lot, her senses sharpened with a clarity that only years of training and experience could provide. She could feel the adrenaline surging through her veins, each step calculated, her breaths measured. The gap between them was closing, and she knew she only had seconds to stop him before he reached his vehicle. Letting him escape wasn't an option, not after the humiliation and the flagrant display of prejudice he had subjected her to. The man's face was a mask of panic as he glanced over his shoulder, his eyes wide with fear. He stumbled over a small crack in the pavement, but managed to catch himself, frantically patting his pockets for his car keys. He was too focused on escape to notice that she was gaining on him, her resolve unwavering. Just as he reached his car, fumbling to get the door open, Jordan closed the last few feet between them and stopped directly behind him. Her voice, firm and authoritative, cut through the tense silence of the parking lot. "Stop right there. You're not going anywhere." The man froze, his keys halfway to the door lock, his shoulders rising and falling with each panicked breath. Slowly, he turned to face her, a forced, nervous smile creeping onto his face as he tried to regain some semblance of control. But Jordan's unyielding expression told him there would be no more intimidation, no more empty threats. This time, he was the one who was trapped. "Look, I think there's been a misunderstanding," he stammered, his voice trembling slightly as he searched for the right words. I didn't realize you were law enforcement. I thought you were just some. Well, I didn't know." "Didn't know what?" Jordan's voice was cold and precise, each word slicing through his feigned innocence. "That I had a right to sit on that bench. That I had every right to be in that park. Or that your actions had consequences." The man's eyes darted around, clearly hoping for an audience that might sympathize with him, or perhaps a bystander who would intervene on his behalf. But the parking lot was empty, save for the two of them, the occasional honk or distant murmur of voices providing the only sounds in the quiet of the early afternoon. He had nowhere to turn, no one to plead his case to. "I'm sorry, all right," he said, his tone defensive. "I didn't mean anything by it. You know how it is, sometimes, things just get heated. It was all just a misunderstanding." "A misunderstanding," Jordan repeated, incredulity lacing her voice. "You grabbed my arm. You threatened me. That goes far beyond a misunderstanding. You thought you could intimidate me because of who you assumed I was, based on nothing more than the color of my skin. And now, when you realize that I'm not who you thought, you want to backtrack and call it a misunderstanding." The man's bravado had crumbled entirely, his face now pale with regret and fear. He looked at her badge, still gleaming in her hand, and swallowed hard. She could see his mind racing, trying to calculate the best way out of this, but Jordan's steady gaze told him there would be no easy escape. "Look, Agent Blake, was it?" he tried, his voice wavering as he addressed her by name, hoping that somehow using it would create a connection, a shred of empathy. This isn't necessary. I'm sorry, okay? I'll leave you alone. I'll never bother you again. Just let me go. We don't need to make a big deal out of this." Jordan took a deep breath, steadying herself. Part of her wanted to let it go, to simply walk away and forget about the encounter. But she knew better. This wasn't just about her. This was about standing up against a pattern of behavior, a culture of entitlement that allowed people like this man to believe they could treat others with disrespect and get away with it. "Let you go," she replied, her voice calm but unwavering. So you can do this to someone else. So you can keep thinking that people like me don't deserve the same respect and space as people like you." He shook his head vigorously, his eyes wide with pleading. "No, no, I swear, I learned my lesson. I'll never do it again. I just didn't know. I thought you were someone else. I didn't mean anything by it." Jordan's jaw tightened, her patience wearing thin. She stepped forward, and he instinctively backed up, bumping into his car as he tried to put some distance between them. His eyes flickered between her and the parking lot exit, calculating his options. She could see the fight-or-flight response taking over, his fear outweighing any rational thought. "Get back against the car," Jordan ordered, her tone brooking no argument. "Put your hands where I can see them." For a moment, he hesitated, looking as though he might try to run. But he could see from the steely determination in her eyes that she wouldn't hesitate to bring him down if he attempted to flee. Reluctantly, he complied, leaning against his car with his hands in the air, his breathing shallow and erratic. "Please," he whispered, the bravado completely gone from his voice. This isn't right. I didn't know." Jordan ignored his pleas, pulling out her phone to call for backup. As she waited for the dispatcher to answer, she kept her gaze fixed on him, her stance firm and unyielding. He had tried to make her feel small, to intimidate her, and now he was learning what it felt like to be on the other side. "This is Agent Blake," she said into the phone, her tone professional. "I'm at Riverside Park, requesting backup for a suspect in custody, attempted assault and resisting law enforcement." The dispatcher acknowledged her request, and she ended the call, tucking her phone back into her pocket. She didn't look away from the man, who was now visibly trembling, his eyes darting around as if searching for some miracle that would save him from the consequences of his actions. As they waited in tense silence, Jordan could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her. She hadn't come to the park to engage in a confrontation, much less to make an arrest. She had come to find peace, to escape the stresses of her work, and yet here she was, thrust into a situation that reminded her of the very battles she fought every day. And yet, as she stood there, she knew that this was about more than just one man's actions. This was a reflection of a larger issue, one that extended far beyond the boundaries of this park. How many others had this man confronted, bullied, and belittled simply because he felt entitled to do so? How many people had walked away feeling as though they didn't belong, as though their presence was a burden? As she waited for backup to arrive, a small crowd began to gather nearby, their curious eyes fixed on the scene unfolding before them. Some whispered to each other, their expressions ranging from shock to amusement. Jordan could feel their gazes on her, but she refused to be distracted. She was here to do her job, to hold this man accountable, and she wouldn't let anyone make her feel otherwise. Finally, she heard the distant wail of sirens approaching, and moments later, a patrol car pulled into the parking lot. Two officers stepped out, their expressions serious as they assessed the situation. Jordan recognized one of them, Officer Chen, a young woman with a reputation for integrity and professionalism. They had worked together on a few cases in the past, and she knew Chen was someone she could trust. "Agent Blake." Officer Chen greeted her, nodding in acknowledgement. She cast a glance at the man, who was still pressed against his car, his face pale with fear. "What do we have here?" Jordan explained the situation, recounting the man's aggression, the assault, and his attempt to flee. Chen listened carefully, her gaze shifting between Jordan and the suspect as she absorbed the details. When Jordan finished, Chen nodded, her expression hardening as she turned to the man. "Sir, you're under arrest for assaulting a federal agent," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. "Please step away from the vehicle and place your hands behind your back." The man opened his mouth to protest, but Chen silenced him with a stern look. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. I suggest you think carefully before you speak." Defeated, the man complied, his shoulders slumping as Chen placed the cuffs on him. His earlier arrogance had been completely stripped away, replaced by a quiet desperation that was almost pitiful to watch. Jordan felt a pang of satisfaction, not out of malice, but out of a sense of justice. For once, someone like him was being held accountable. As Officer Chen led the man to the patrol car, Jordan watched, her heart pounding with a mix of emotions. She felt a surge of pride, knowing that she had stood her ground, that she had refused to be intimidated. But there was also a sense of sadness, a reminder of the countless others who faced similar challenges, who had been made to feel as though they didn't belong. Chen returned to her, her expression softening. "Good work, Agent Blake," she said quietly. "You handled that well. Not everyone would have kept their cool like you did." Jordan nodded, managing a faint smile. "Thank you, Officer Chen. Sometimes it feels like these battles are never ending." Chen placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "But every time we stand up, every time we refuse to back down, we make a difference. And today, you made a difference." Jordan nodded, her resolve renewed. She knew that this was only one confrontation in a long line of challenges she would face. But as she stood there, watching the patrol car drive away with the man in the backseat, she felt a quiet strength settle within her. She wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for everyone who had ever been made to feel small, for everyone who had been told they didn't belong. And as she turned back to the park, reclaiming her spot on that quiet bench by the lake, Jordan knew that she would continue to stand up, to fight, to demand respect, not just for herself, but for a world that desperately needed to change. Ripples of recognition. After the incident at Riverside Park, Jordan Blake returned to her daily routine as an FBI agent, but the confrontation lingered in her mind. She had been prepared for moments of danger in her line of work, but this particular encounter was different. This wasn't a criminal targeting her out of malice or desperation. This was a man who had felt emboldened by his prejudice, so confident in his entitlement that he had tried to intimidate her simply for existing in a shared space. The weight of it bore down on her over the next few days. Even as she moved through her cases and investigations, she found herself thinking back to that man's face, the moment of pure shock that had crossed his features when he saw her badge. It was as if her authority as a federal agent had somehow negated his assumptions about her, transforming her, in his eyes, from someone he felt free to bully into someone he was forced to respect. Her colleagues at the FBI, many of whom were unaware of what had happened, noticed the slight change in her demeanor. Though she continued to perform her job with the same precision and focus, there was a lingering intensity in her expression, a quiet fire that seemed to burn even brighter than before. One morning, as Jordan was sifting through case files at her desk, her supervisor, Agent Marcus Langley, approached her. Marcus was a seasoned agent with silver hair and a calm demeanor that had guided the younger agents through many challenges. He respected Jordan's work ethic and had always regarded her as one of his most reliable agents. "Blake," he greeted her, folding his arms as he leaned against her desk. "I've been hearing some things. There's word going around about something that happened in Riverside Park. Care to fill me in?" Jordan's eyebrows lifted slightly, surprised that the incident had made its way back to the office. She hesitated, then sighed, setting her files aside. "It was nothing official, sir. Just a personal matter that got a bit out of hand." Marcus studied her, his eyes narrowing slightly. "I think you know by now, Blake, that personal matters don't stay personal for long when they involve one of my agents, especially not when there are arrests involved." Jordan felt her cheeks warm slightly. She wasn't accustomed to being the subject of office gossip, much less for something unrelated to her work. But she could see that Marcus wasn't prying out of idle curiosity. He genuinely wanted to understand. "All right," she said, folding her hands. "I went to the park to clear my head, and this man, he approached me, tried to intimidate me, claiming I was sitting in his spot. When I didn't move, he started making remarks." "Remarks?" Marcus prompted. Jordan nodded, her voice steady. "Racial remarks, sir. He assumed he could bully me because he didn't see me as someone who belonged there. Things escalated. He grabbed my arm, and I was left with no choice but to show my badge and arrest him. Marcus let out a low whistle, his expression shifting to one of respect. "Sounds like you handled it well. I'm glad you didn't let him get away with it." Jordan shrugged, her tone modest. "I just did what anyone would do in that situation." But Marcus shook his head. "No, Blake, you did what someone with courage and integrity would do. A lot of people might have walked away, just to avoid the trouble. But you stood your ground." Jordan appreciated his words, though she felt a twinge of discomfort at being the focus of such praise. "Thank you, sir. I didn't want to let him get away with thinking he could intimidate people like that. It was bigger than just me." Marcus nodded thoughtfully. "It usually is, isn't it?" He paused, as if debating something, then said, "Actually, that's part of the reason I came over here. The director heard about the incident, and she's been working on a new initiative, one focused on bridging trust between law enforcement and marginalized communities. She thinks you'd be a good fit to lead some of the outreach efforts." Jordan blinked in surprise, her mind racing. Outreach. She hadn't anticipated being pulled into a project of that nature, but the idea intrigued her. She had always wanted to make a difference, and this could be an opportunity to tackle some of the underlying issues she'd faced in her career and life. "I'm interested," she said slowly, her tone cautious. "But what exactly would that entail?" Marcus leaned in, his expression animated as he explained. "The idea is to have agents like you, agents who have experienced prejudice firsthand, reach out to communities where there's mistrust. We'll hold workshops, seminars, create forums for people to share their concerns with law enforcement. The director wants to make it clear that we're listening, that we're not just here to enforce the law, but to be part of the community." Jordan considered his words, her mind racing with possibilities. She had faced prejudice in subtle and overt ways throughout her life and career. She knew what it felt like to be doubted, to be judged before she even spoke. But she also knew the importance of having allies, of building trust through understanding. "All right," she said finally, a small smile tugging at her lips. "Count me in. I'd love to be a part of that." Marcus grinned, clapping her on the shoulder. "I had a feeling you would. You'll be working closely with community leaders, and we'll make sure you have the resources you need to make an impact." The following week, Jordan found herself diving headfirst into the new outreach program. She attended meetings with community leaders, brainstorming ways to foster a better relationship between the FBI and local residents. She collaborated with fellow agents who had faced similar challenges, each of them bringing their unique perspectives to the table. One of the first events they organized was a community forum held at the Brookfield Civic Center. The goal was simple: to listen. No speeches, no presentations, just a chance for people to share their experiences, their concerns, and their ideas on how law enforcement could better serve them. The auditorium was packed that evening, filled with people from all walks of life. Jordan felt a mixture of anticipation and nervousness as she looked around, recognizing that some of the people in attendance likely harbored deep distrust toward law enforcement. But that was exactly why she was there, to break down those walls, one conversation at a time. As the forum began, people took turns sharing their stories. Some spoke of encounters with officers that had left them feeling humiliated or fearful. Others shared positive experiences, moments when officers had shown kindness and respect. Each story was raw, personal, and deeply impactful. Jordan listened intently, her heart aching with empathy. She understood the pain, the frustration, the longing for justice and equality. She had felt those same emotions countless times, both as a civilian and as an agent. When it was her turn to speak, she rose from her seat, facing the audience with a steady gaze. She took a deep breath, gathering her thoughts before she spoke. "My name is Jordan Blake, and I'm an FBI agent," she began, her voice strong and clear. "But before anything else, I'm a person who has faced many of the same struggles you've described tonight. I know what it feels like to be judged by the color of my skin before I even open my mouth. I know what it's like to be told I don't belong, simply because of who I am." The room was silent, all eyes fixed on her as she continued. "I want you to know that I didn't come here to speak at you. I came here to listen, to learn, and to find ways that we can make things better, together. Law enforcement is supposed to protect and serve all of us, not just some of us. And if there are changes that need to be made, then it's up to people like me, and people like you, to make those changes happen." A hand shot up in the audience, and Jordan nodded to a young woman with a determined look in her eyes. "What makes you think things will be different this time?" the woman asked, her tone skeptical. "We've heard these promises before, and nothing changes. How do we know you're not just here to make yourselves look good?" Jordan met the woman's gaze, acknowledging her frustration. "I understand your skepticism," she said, "and I don't blame you. But I'm not asking you to trust me blindly. I'm asking you to give me, and this program, a chance. Change takes time, and it takes effort from both sides. We're here because we want to be held accountable. We want to be part of the solution." Another person spoke up, a middle-aged man with a weathered face. "I don't know if you realize how hard it is for people like us to believe in the system," he said, his voice filled with quiet pain. "We've been disappointed too many times." Jordan nodded, her heart heavy with understanding. "I know it's hard," she replied gently. "And I know that one forum, one conversation, won't erase years of mistrust. But I promise you, we're committed to this. I'm committed to this. I'm not here to pay lip service. I'm here to make a difference, however small it might seem." The forum continued, each person's story adding to the complex tapestry of experiences, hopes, and fears. By the end of the evening, Jordan felt both exhausted and invigorated. She knew that the road ahead would be challenging, filled with setbacks and resistance. But she also knew that they had taken a small but meaningful step forward. As she left the Civic Center that night, Jordan felt a renewed sense of purpose. The confrontation at Riverside Park had ignited something within her, a desire to push beyond her role as an agent and become a force for change in the community. She knew it wouldn't be easy, but she was ready. The next morning, Jordan received an unexpected email. It was from the young woman who had questioned her at the forum. Her message was simple. "Thank you for listening. I don't know if I believe in the system yet, but I believe in you." Jordan smiled, feeling the surge of hope. Change, she realized, wasn't about grand gestures or sweeping reforms. It was about connection, about seeing people as they were, and about meeting them where they stood. And as she looked out at the sunrise over Brookfield, she knew that this was just the beginning. The journey ahead was long, but she was ready to walk it, step by step, story by story, until justice was no longer a distant ideal, but a reality for everyone, a growing movement. In the days following the community forum, Agent Jordan Blake found herself at the center of a quiet but powerful shift. Her words, her presence, and her unwavering stance during the forum had sparked a ripple effect in Brookfield. People from various neighborhoods, some of whom had once harbored deep distrust of law enforcement, reached out to her, wanting to be a part of the change she had promised. What had begun as a tense confrontation in Riverside Park was now evolving into something much bigger, a movement toward understanding and mutual respect. Her inbox was filled with messages from community members, many of whom wanted to share their stories, offer ideas, or simply thank her for listening. Some emails were from people who had attended the forum and felt inspired, while others came from those who had heard about the event through friends or social media. Jordan's name was starting to circulate in Brookfield as more than just another FBI agent. She was becoming a bridge, a symbol of hope in a city where tensions had often run high. One message in particular caught her eye. It was from Pastor Lewis, a respected leader in the local Black community, who invited her to attend a meeting at his church. The church, New Light Baptist, was more than a place of worship. It was a gathering space, a center of resilience and solidarity where people came together to find comfort, strength, and guidance. Pastor Lewis had been a vocal advocate for justice and equality, and his support carried significant weight within the community. Jordan accepted the invitation, feeling both honored and slightly nervous. She knew that New Light Baptist Church was a place where many had faced painful injustices, and she didn't want to overstep her role. She understood that her presence could be met with skepticism or even resistance. But she also knew that real change required stepping out of her comfort zone and meeting people where they were. On the evening of the meeting, Jordan dressed in plain clothes, a simple blouse and slacks, with no badge or gun. She wanted to enter the space as a person, not as a symbol of authority. As she arrived at the church, she noticed a small group of people gathered on the steps, talking in low voices. They glanced at her as she approached, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and caution. Taking a deep breath, Jordan gave them a polite nod and walked up the steps. Inside, the church was warm and inviting, with soft lighting and rows of wooden pews. The walls were adorned with photographs and mementos of the church's history, a testament to its role as a pillar of the community. The hum of quiet conversations filled the air, and Jordan could feel the weight of history and resilience in every corner. Pastor Lewis spotted her as she entered and greeted her with a warm smile. He was a tall, dignified man in his 60s, with a deep voice that commanded both respect and comfort. His presence was calming, and Jordan immediately felt at ease as he approached her with an outstretched hand. "Agent Blake," he said, his voice rich with warmth. "Thank you for coming. We're honored to have you here." "Thank you for inviting me, Pastor Lewis," Jordan replied, shaking his hand. "It means a lot to be welcomed into your space." He gestured for her to follow him down the center aisle, where a group of people had begun to gather in a semicircle near the altar. Jordan recognized some of them from the forum: community leaders, activists, teachers, and parents. She saw the young woman who had questioned her at the forum sitting near the front, her arms crossed but her eyes attentive. As they took their seats, Pastor Lewis addressed the group, his voice carrying a quiet authority. "Tonight, we're here to continue the conversation we started at the forum. We've all felt the weight of prejudice, the burden of injustice, and the frustration of being unheard. But I believe that we have an opportunity here, an opportunity to build something meaningful with Agent Blake's support." He turned to Jordan, giving her an encouraging nod. "Agent Blake, would you mind sharing what brings you here tonight?" Jordan stood, feeling the eyes of the room on her. She took a moment to gather her thoughts, knowing that her words had to carry sincerity, humility, and conviction. "First of all, I want to thank you for allowing me to be here," she began, her voice steady. "I didn't come here to make promises or to lecture. I came here to listen, to understand, and to figure out how I can be of service to this community. I know that my badge carries a lot of history, some of it painful. I know that it represents a system that hasn't always been fair or just, and I'm not here to pretend that I can erase that history. But what I can do is stand with you in the effort to make things better." Her gaze swept the room, meeting each set of eyes with an openness that conveyed her sincerity. "I'm not here as just an agent. I'm here as someone who has also experienced prejudice, who has felt the sting of being underestimated because of who I am. I know that trust has to be earned, and I'm willing to work to earn it." A silence settled over the room as her words sank in. The young woman from the forum, whose name Jordan remembered as Tasha, raised her hand, her expression thoughtful. "So, Agent Blake," Tasha began, her tone cautious but respectful, "what exactly do you want to accomplish here? I mean, it's great that you want to listen, but we've had people listen to us before. What makes this any different?" Jordan nodded, acknowledging the validity of the question. "I want to do more than just listen, Tasha," she replied. "I want to work with all of you to find concrete ways to address the issues we're facing. Whether it's police accountability, community programs, or providing more resources, I want this to be a partnership where we create solutions together." Another voice spoke up, this time from an elderly woman sitting near the back. Her face was lined with wisdom and experience, and she held herself with a quiet dignity. "We've been promised a lot over the years, Agent Blake," she said, her voice soft but firm. "But promises don't pay bills. Promises don't put food on the table or protect our children. What can you offer us that's real?" Jordan met the woman's gaze, feeling the weight of her words. "You're right. Promises alone won't change anything. That's why I'm here to talk about actions. I want to work with Pastor Lewis and other community leaders to set up workshops where we can discuss specific concerns, bring in resources, and work on policies that can actually make a difference." Pastor Lewis nodded, his face thoughtful. "One idea we've been discussing is creating a liaison team, a group of community members who can work directly with Agent Blake and other law enforcement officials. This team would be responsible for voicing community concerns, providing feedback, and holding law enforcement accountable." The room buzzed with murmurs of interest, and Jordan felt a spark of hope. The idea of a liaison team was promising, a bridge that could connect the community with law enforcement in a way that fostered transparency and accountability. "I think that's a great idea," Jordan said, her enthusiasm evident. "A liaison team would give the community a direct line of communication with us, and it would ensure that your voices aren't just heard, they're acted upon." Tasha leaned forward, her skepticism softening. "All right, so let's say we have this liaison team. What's to stop the FBI or the police from ignoring our concerns? How do we know you're really committed?" Jordan considered her question carefully, recognizing the importance of trust. "Because I'm putting my career on the line for this," she replied, her voice unwavering. "I've been vocal with my superiors about the importance of this initiative, and I've made it clear that I believe in it wholeheartedly. If this fails, it won't just be on you. It'll be on me, and I'm not willing to let that happen." The room fell silent again, the weight of her words settling over everyone. She could feel the doubt, the hope, the cautious optimism mingling in the air. She knew that earning their trust would take time, but she was ready to commit herself fully. As the meeting continued, Jordan listened as community members shared their ideas, their grievances, and their hopes for the future. Some spoke of the need for more youth programs to keep kids off the streets, while others emphasized the importance of mental health resources. Each voice added a new layer to the conversation, creating the mosaic of perspectives that deepened her understanding of the challenges they faced. By the end of the evening, they had developed a tentative plan for the liaison team, with Pastor Lewis and a few other respected community members agreeing to lead the initiative. They also discussed organizing monthly meetings where Jordan and other agents could update the community on their progress, answer questions, and gather feedback. As people began to leave, Jordan felt a hand on her shoulder. She turned to see Pastor Lewis, his expression one of pride and gratitude. "You did well tonight, Agent Blake," he said warmly. "You came here as a stranger, but I think you'll find that you're leaving as a friend." Jordan smiled, feeling the surge of gratitude. "Thank you, Pastor. I won't take that lightly. I meant every word I said. I'm committed to making a difference." He nodded, his gaze filled with quiet conviction. "I believe you, and so does this community, even if some of them are too cautious to admit it just yet. Trust takes time, but I think you're on the right path." As Jordan left the church, the cool night air felt invigorating. She walked down the empty street, her mind buzzing with the events of the evening. She had come to Brookfield with a singular purpose: to do her job as an FBI agent. But now, that purpose had expanded into something far more meaningful. She knew that this journey would be fraught with challenges. There would be setbacks, resistance, and moments of doubt. But she was no stranger to adversity. She had spent her life overcoming obstacles, breaking down barriers, and proving her worth. And now she was ready to channel that resilience into something that could uplift an entire community. In the days that followed, the groundwork for the liaison team began to take shape. Pastor Lewis and other community leaders held meetings to select members for the team, while Jordan worked with her superiors to ensure that the initiative received the support it needed. For the first time in a long time, Jordan felt a deep sense of fulfillment, not just as an agent, but as a person making a tangible difference. She was no longer just a symbol of law enforcement. She was an ally, a friend, and a bridge. And as the community began to rally around the initiative, she knew that they were building something powerful, something that could withstand the weight of prejudice and pave the way for a brighter, more inclusive future. And through it all, Jordan reminded herself of one simple truth. True change begins with listening, understanding, and standing together. And she was ready to stand with Brookfield, no matter what obstacles lay ahead, uncovering hidden biases. As the liaison team continued to develop, Jordan Blake found herself delving deeper into the complexities of her role, not only as an FBI agent, but as a bridge between law enforcement and a community that had historically been wary of it. The early stages of the program had been promising, with support from both community leaders and law enforcement officials, but she knew that the hardest work was yet to come. The liaison team, officially named Brookfield Community Alliance, held its first official meeting 2 weeks after the church gathering. The team consisted of Pastor Lewis, Tasha, a few other community leaders, local business owners, educators, and youth mentors. Each member brought a unique perspective, representing various segments of Brookfield's diverse population. For many of them, this was not only a commitment to change, but also a personal journey of healing past wounds. The first meeting was held at a local community center, and Jordan arrived early, taking a moment to walk around the small, humble building that had served as a cornerstone for so many neighborhood events and gatherings over the years. The walls were decorated with photos of community events, children's artwork, and inspirational quotes that hinted at the strength and resilience of the people who had gathered there for generations. As she walked through the center, Jordan's thoughts drifted back to her own childhood. Growing up, she had spent many afternoons at a similar center in her hometown, a place where her mother had taken her and her siblings to escape the harsh realities of their neighborhood. It was there that she had learned the value of community, of having a safe space where she could express herself without fear. Now, standing in the Brookfield Community Center, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. She wanted to help make this space safe for everyone, to ensure that no one felt marginalized or overlooked. By the time the meeting began, the room was filled with a diverse group of people, each one representing a different part of the community. Jordan could sense both anticipation and apprehension in the air as people took their seats, exchanging cautious glances and quiet nods. She knew that for many of them, this was an uncomfortable step. Collaborating with law enforcement was a difficult leap for people who had long harbored distrust. Pastor Lewis began the meeting with a warm greeting, his calming presence putting people at ease. "I know that many of us are here with mixed feelings," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "We all come from different backgrounds, and we've all had different experiences. But today, we're here as one community. Let's remember that as we move forward." He then introduced Jordan, who stood and gave a brief, heartfelt introduction. "Thank you all for being here," she began, her voice carrying a blend of humility and determination. "I know that trust isn't something that can be given freely, especially when there's a history of pain and disappointment. But I'm here to listen, to work alongside you, and to take meaningful action." Tasha, seated in the front row, crossed her arms but gave Jordan a small nod of acknowledgement. "All right, Agent Blake," she said, her tone a mix of skepticism and genuine curiosity. "We're here. You're here. What are we going to do next?" Jordan smiled, appreciating Tasha's directness. "The next step is to identify the specific issues that concern you the most," she replied. "I want to hear about the real, tangible problems that you're facing, and I want us to work together to find solutions." A middle-aged man named Marco, a local barber who had seen Brookfield change over the decades, raised his hand. "I've been hearing a lot about these implicit bias workshops for police," he said. "How do we know that those things are actually working? I mean, it's all well and good to sit in a room and talk about it, but does that actually change anything?" Jordan nodded, acknowledging his point. "That's a fair question, Marco. Implicit bias training is just one step, and it's certainly not a cure-all. It's meant to make officers aware of their biases, those hidden attitudes and beliefs that they might not even realize they have. But I agree with you. Awareness alone isn't enough. What matters is how we act on that awareness. Pastor Lewis chimed in. It's about accountability, isn't it? He said. How do we hold people accountable for the biases they might bring into their work? And how do we ensure that those biases don't result in harm to our community? Jordan took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the questions. She knew that these were not easy problems to solve, but she was determined to approach them with honesty and transparency. One of the things we're working on is implementing a system of checks and balances, she said. For example, if a community member feels that they were treated unfairly by an officer, they should have a clear, safe way to report it. The Brookfield Community Alliance can help bridge that gap, ensuring that complaints are taken seriously and that there's follow-up. The room was quiet as people absorbed her words. Then, Tasha spoke up again, her tone cautious but curious. But what about the officers themselves? Are they actually going to be open to this kind of accountability? I mean, no offense, but a lot of them don't seem too interested in changing. Jordan felt a pang of empathy. She understood where Tasha was coming from. She had faced similar frustrations within the ranks herself. You're right, Tasha. There are some who resist change. But I believe that most people, given the right guidance and support, are capable of growth. It's not about blaming or shaming. It's about creating a culture where everyone understands that accountability makes us better at what we do. The conversation continued, with community members sharing their stories and frustrations. One woman, an elementary school teacher named Ms. Franklin, spoke about how her students, many of whom came from low-income families, felt a constant sense of fear and mistrust toward police officers. These kids see officers as people who only show up when something bad happens, she said. How do we change that? Jordan considered her words carefully before replying. Maybe we need to change the way officers engage with the community, she suggested. Instead of just showing up in crisis situations, what if officers were involved in community events? They could visit schools, participate in neighborhood cleanups, or even coach sports teams. If we change the context in which kids see officers, we can start to shift their perceptions. The room buzzed with agreement, and a few people nodded thoughtfully. Jordan could see that they were beginning to see her not just as an outsider, but as someone who genuinely wanted to help. She felt a surge of hope, but she knew that hope alone wouldn't be enough. It was time to take concrete steps toward change. As the meeting wrapped up, Pastor Lewis pulled Jordan aside. I can see that you're making an impact, he said, his voice filled with quiet pride. But there's something you should know. There are people in the community who aren't here tonight, people who are deeply distrustful, even angry, about this alliance. They believe that working with law enforcement is a betrayal of everything they fought for. Jordan nodded, her expression serious. She had anticipated resistance, but hearing it from Pastor Lewis made it all the more real. I understand, she replied. And I don't expect everyone to trust me, but I'm here for the people who are willing to give this a chance. Maybe, in time, we can win over the others too. Pastor Lewis gave her a reassuring smile. Just remember, change is a marathon, not a sprint. You're planting seeds here, and it may be a long time before they grow. But every step you take matters. That night, as Jordan lay in bed, she thought about the people who hadn't come to the meeting. She understood their anger, their reluctance to engage with a system that had failed them so many times before. But she also knew that her work wasn't just about changing laws or policies. It was about changing hearts, one person at a time. The following week, Jordan attended a ride-along with local police officers as part of her outreach efforts. She wanted to understand their perspectives and see firsthand how they interacted with the community. The officer she rode with, Officer Bennett, was a young, ambitious recruit who had grown up in Brookfield. He was eager to show her the challenges and rewards of his work, and Jordan was struck by his genuine desire to make a difference. During the ride-along, They responded to a noise complaint in a neighborhood known for its frequent clashes with law enforcement. As they approached the scene, a small group of teenagers stood by, watching them with wary eyes. Jordan could feel the tension in the air, the unspoken distrust that hung between the officers and the young people. Bennett, sensing the tension, approached the group cautiously, his tone respectful but firm. "Evening, folks. We just got a call about some loud music. Mind turning it down a bit?" One of the teenagers, a tall boy with a defiant glare, crossed his arms. "We're just having a good time. What's the problem?" Jordan observed quietly, impressed by Bennett's approach. He didn't escalate the situation. Instead, he engaged with the group, treating them as individuals rather than potential threats. "No problem, man. We just got a call, so we had to check it out," Bennett said. "You're free to keep hanging out. Just keep the volume down a bit, all right?" The tension in the air eased as the teenagers nodded, their expressions softening. Jordan could see that this was the kind of interaction that could plant the seeds of trust, small moments of respect that, over time, could shift perceptions. As they drove away, Bennett turned to her, a slight frown on his face. "It's not always easy," he admitted. "Sometimes I feel like no matter how hard I try, people will always see me as the enemy." Jordan nodded, understanding his frustration. "That's why we have to keep trying," she said. "Trust doesn't come overnight, but every positive interaction, every respectful conversation, brings us one step closer." By the end of the night, Jordan felt a renewed sense of purpose. She knew that the road ahead would be long and filled with challenges, but she was ready to face them. She had seen firsthand the power of empathy, of listening, and of treating people with dignity. And she believed that, with enough persistence, they could build a future where communities and law enforcement work together as allies rather than adversaries. As she left the station that night, she thought back to the confrontation in Riverside Park. What had begun as a moment of anger and injustice had transformed into a journey toward healing, understanding, and change. Jordan knew that the work was far from over, but she was ready to keep fighting. For herself, for her community, and for a world where respect and justice prevailed over fear and prejudice. The journey was just beginning. But Jordan felt certain of one thing: she would see it through, no matter how long it took. A moment of truth. Months passed, and the Brookfield Community Alliance had grown stronger, bringing tangible change to the community. The liaison team, with the support of Jordan Blake and Pastor Lewis, had organized numerous workshops, community events, and listening sessions that allowed residents to voice their concerns and engage directly with law enforcement. The town had started to shift in ways that were both subtle and significant, with people showing a new willingness to engage and officers demonstrating more empathy and understanding. But the journey was far from over, and Jordan knew that the hardest challenges often came when you least expected them. One evening, Jordan received an urgent call from Pastor Lewis. His voice, usually calm and reassuring, sounded tense. "Jordan, we need you at the community center. There's a situation that's escalating, and I think your presence could make a difference." She felt her heart quicken as she gathered her things and headed out the door. Her work with the Alliance had taken on a life of its own, and she was no stranger to receiving calls like this. The trust she had built with the community and with law enforcement officers had made her a go-to mediator when tensions rose. But the intensity in Pastor Lewis's voice told her that this situation was different, something more volatile, something that could threaten everything they'd worked for. When she arrived at the community center, she was greeted by a tense scene. A crowd had gathered outside, their voices loud and heated. Many of the faces in the crowd were familiar. These were the people she had come to know over the past few months. Neighbors, community leaders, and even some teenagers who had attended their events. But tonight, their expressions were filled with anger, frustration, and pain. Pastor Lewis met her at the entrance, his brow furrowed. "There was an incident," he explained, his voice low. "One of our young men, a boy named Isaiah, was pulled over by an officer. They claimed it was for a routine stop, but it quickly escalated, and Isaiah ended up being handcuffed and detained. People are saying the officer used excessive force. Jordan felt a knot form in her stomach. Incidents like these were exactly what they had been working to prevent, and yet here they were, facing the very issue that had brought them together. "Is Isaiah all right?" she asked. "He's shaken up but unharmed," Pastor Lewis replied. "But his family, friends, and neighbors are here, demanding answers. They want justice, Jordan. They feel like this alliance was supposed to protect them from things like this." She nodded, feeling the weight of the community's trust resting heavily on her shoulders. This wasn't just about one young man. It was about the promise she had made to a community that had taken a chance on her. This was a test of everything they had built together, and she knew that how she handled this moment could determine the future of the alliance. As she approached the crowd, people began to recognize her, and a hush fell over them. Tasha, who had been one of the loudest voices of support for Isaiah, stepped forward, her expression hard but pleading. "Agent Blake, we need answers. We need accountability. This isn't the first time something like this has happened, but we thought it would be the last. We thought you were here to protect us from this." Jordan took a deep breath, meeting Tasha's gaze. She could see the pain and betrayal in her eyes, the hope that had been crushed by a single encounter. "I understand, Tasha," she said, her voice calm but filled with empathy. "I came here tonight to listen to you and to make sure that your concerns are taken seriously. I promise you there will be a full investigation into what happened with Isaiah. But for that investigation to have any meaning, I need you to trust the process we've built together." Tasha's jaw tightened, her arms crossed over her chest. "Trust the process," she repeated, a hint of skepticism in her tone. "You know as well as I do that people like us have been told to trust the process our whole lives. And where has it gotten us? Right back to this same spot, every time." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd, and Jordan felt a wave of frustration. She understood their pain and skepticism, but she also knew that if they let this moment tear them apart, it would set their progress back by months, if not years. "You're right, Tasha," she said, her tone firm but understanding. "The system has failed people like us for a long time, and that's exactly why we created this alliance, to hold people accountable and to make sure that no one is above the law. I know that tonight feels like a step backward, but I'm asking you to believe in the work we've done together. I'm asking you to let me fight for Isaiah and for all of you." A voice from the back of the crowd shouted, "And what if they cover it up? What if they say it was all by the book?" Jordan's eyes scanned the crowd, her heart aching at the doubt and fear she saw on so many faces. These were the same people who had looked to her with hope and gratitude just weeks ago, and now she was faced with the task of rebuilding their trust in a single night. "Then we'll hold them accountable," she replied, her voice strong. "We built this alliance for situations just like this. If the officer was in the wrong, we will demand justice, and we won't back down until we get it. But we have to be unified. We have to approach this with strength and resolve. We can't let anger be the only thing guiding us." As she spoke, she saw some heads nodding, though others remained skeptical. Tasha seemed to study her, weighing her words carefully. Jordan could tell that she was considering whether to trust her once more, whether to let this alliance work as it was intended. Finally, Tasha spoke, her voice quieter but resolute. "All right, Agent Blake, we'll give you a chance. But if this investigation turns out to be just another empty promise, we're done. The alliance is over." Jordan nodded, understanding the gravity of her words. "I wouldn't expect anything less," she replied. "If this doesn't work, I'll be the first to step down." The crowd gradually dispersed, and Jordan felt a wave of relief, tempered by the knowledge that this was just the beginning. She knew that this situation was fragile, that any misstep could shatter the trust they had built. But she was determined to see it through, to show them that their faith in her had not been misplaced. The next morning, Jordan initiated an investigation into the incident with Isaiah. She met with the officer involved, reviewing body camera footage, interviewing witnesses, and working closely with Pastor Lewis and other community leaders to keep them informed every step of the way. It was a painstaking process, and tensions remained high as people waited anxiously for answers. Over the course of the investigation, Jordan uncovered evidence that the officer had indeed acted inappropriately. The footage revealed a clear misuse of authority, an assumption of guilt based on Isaiah's appearance rather than his actions. It was a painful reminder of the biases that still existed within the system, the very thing the Alliance had been created to address. Jordan knew that her next step would be the most difficult one yet. She had to take the findings to her superiors and demand disciplinary action against the officer, a move that would likely be met with resistance, given the politics and power dynamics within the Bureau. When she presented her findings, her supervisors were visibly uncomfortable. One of them, Deputy Director Green, was a man known for his loyalty to his officers and his reluctance to admit fault. "Blake," he said, his tone strained, "are you absolutely certain about this? You know the kind of backlash we're going to get if we discipline this officer. It'll make us look weak." Jordan met his gaze without flinching. "Sir, the facts are clear. This officer acted inappropriately and violated protocol. If we don't hold him accountable, we'll be betraying the very community we're supposed to serve. The Alliance was built on the promise of accountability, and if we don't honor that, then the entire initiative is worthless." Green hesitated, his expression conflicted. But Jordan's resolve was unshakable, her voice unwavering. She wasn't just advocating for Isaiah. She was advocating for every person in Brookfield who had put their trust in her. After a long, tense silence, Green sighed. "Fine, the officer will face disciplinary action. But Blake, know that this isn't going to be easy. You've made waves, and not everyone is happy about it." Jordan nodded, unbothered by the warning. "I didn't come here to make everyone happy, sir. I came here to make a difference." With Green's reluctant approval, she left his office, feeling both triumphant and exhausted. She knew that her actions had likely earned her more enemies within the Bureau, but she also knew that she had upheld her commitment to the community. That was what mattered. Later that evening, she met with the Brookfield Community Alliance to share the results of the investigation. The room was filled with tension as she stood before them, her heart pounding as she prepared to deliver the news. "The investigation has concluded," she announced, her voice steady. "The officer involved has been found to have violated protocol, and disciplinary action will be taken. This isn't just a victory for Isaiah. It's a victory for all of us. This is what accountability looks like." A stunned silence filled the room, followed by a wave of applause and cheers. People stood, clapping and hugging one another, their faces filled with relief and gratitude. Tasha approached her, a tentative smile on her face. "You did it, Agent Blake," she said softly. "You kept your word." Jordan smiled, feeling the surge of pride and humility. "We did it, Tasha. This alliance is only as strong as the people who believe in it." As the night wore on, Jordan stayed to celebrate with the community, feeling a deep sense of fulfillment. She knew that their journey was far from over, that there would be more challenges and setbacks. But tonight, they had won a hard-fought battle for justice, and they had proven that change was possible. Standing in the center of the community that had come to trust her, Jordan felt a profound sense of belonging. She had come to Brookfield as an outsider, but now she was part of something bigger, a family, a movement, a force for change. And as she looked around at the faces of the people she had come to love and respect, she knew that this was only the beginning. Together, they would continue to fight for a future where justice, dignity, and respect were not just ideals but realities. In that moment, Jordan Blake realized that she was no longer just an agent or an advocate. She was a symbol of hope and resilience, a reminder that even in the face of prejudice and adversity, it was possible to build a world where everyone could stand together as equals. And for the first time, she felt truly at peace, knowing that she was exactly where she was meant to be.